alternative, innovative ways to actually monitor the vineyards without having problems with canopies growing into one another. So it was designed with that purpose. You'll see that in between we have just a green row, which is the dryland buffer rows. So in terms of what we have there, we have the factor one is cultivars and rootstock combinations. So we have Cabernet Sauvignon, Shiraz, Pinotage, and then on 2 rootstocks, Richter 110 and also US 8-7. The second factor is irrigation strategies, where we have a dry land. We plant the vines under dry land conditions from the beginning. And then we also have a well-watered situation, which is linked to industry-level irrigation, as well as a much reduced level. Now, all of what I'm talking about here is, of course, not Chenin Blanc. I'm coming to that. But this is the rest of the block there. And in essence, it means that we have 90 experimental units and measurement points in this vineyard. The buffer rows are actually where the Chenin Blanc is planted. So we have, because of the extensive phenotypic plasticity of Chenin Blanc and its adaptability already, we decided to plant our buffer rows on the dryland buffer rows with Chenin. So it's an experiment within an experiment. In this case, we have the Chenin Blanc buffer rows on 4 different rootstocks, repeated twice in the block. And then the 4 rootstocks are indicated there. And we have on the outside of the vineyard, we have buffer rows, or not the buffer rows, the well-watered controls also included in this vineyard. So if we look at the whole vineyard or the whole block layout, you can see it looks quite complicated. Each of these little blocks are a different combination of rootstock science with the different irrigation regimes, and then repeated at least 5 times in the block, like I explained already. But then in terms of the Chenin Blanc, please remember that we're talking about the in-between rows, the buffer rows, and the experimental units here is much bigger. So we have a bigger number of vines, which will be very good for us when we go into the winemaking side. So to simplify it a little bit, I'm forgetting about the other cultivars now, and now I'm just focusing on the Chenin Blanc layout. As I mentioned, in blue here, you see the well-watered Chenin Blancs on the 2 rootstocks on this side, 110 Richter and Richter 110 and 99, and then the other 2 rootstocks on that, indicating the well-watered condition. And then here in red are the rows where we have the dry land conditions with 2 repeats for each of them. So treatments per row, 10 panels of 5 vines each, 12 rows. Every second panel is subjected to measurements, and that means that we have 60 measuring points for the Chenin Blanc. And specifically for water, we have access tubes for neutron probe measurements up to a depth of over 1 meter. So the full project, what do we want to do? I've been telling you now about how we've designed it, what is in there. What is it that how do we get to answer some of those questions that was mentioned? How do we understand plant resilience? How do we understand adaptability with this resource? Because the vineyard is just a resource. So the full project that we have here, of course, in the middle, we have the plant material. And as I mentioned, it's several different cultivars on different rootstocks. We have that. We can measure and add information about the biology of the plants or the interaction of the plants with the environment. We're controlling the environment in terms of irrigation. As I mentioned, we either have dry land or well-watered or a reduced level of irrigation. So those levels of irrigation is managed. And then, of course, one can start to measure. The climate monitoring needs to be very accurate and complete. to give us an indication of how much rain fell, what the temperature profiles was, and incident light and all of those things. We, of course, can also do soil water dynamics since we are working on irrigation, so we have the ability to measure the soil moisture and also do water balancing. So that's the obvious things that we need to measure. We include plant water status and water use in these measurements to tell us not only how much water is available or was available to the plants, but how did the plant respond to it. So those are the classical aspects that one would measure. We can add root architectural analysis in this to see how, under those conditions, remember starting from the planting of the vines, how did the plants respond under those 3 irrigation regimes on the different rootstocks in terms of their use of the soil volume that was available. And what is very important now is, of course, we can start to study the cyan rootstock interactions in the context that we generate. So we can look at the growth, the development, the biomass, the architecture, the physiology of the plants. What makes this study also unique is, in addition to that, we are asking, and specifically to answer the question about adaptation, we are asking what is the epigenetic profiles of this specific, of the typical scenarios that we're generating. And I will come back to epigenetics to explain it a little bit. Yesterday there was some talk about that, but it means that we are also looking at the intrinsic adaptation mechanisms that the plant might use. And very much linked to the discussion that we had this morning about regenerative work or viticulture, we are also including possible extrinsic adaptation strategies that might be at play here. The soil, root, rhizosphere microbiomes that we can follow them, we can see how the different irrigation regimes changes or influences perhaps the microbes in the soil with different microbiomics techniques. In the end, all of these data will, of course, also culminate to inform the grape to wine analysis, which once the vineyard is productive and starting to form berries this year, we will, of course, follow not only the physiological measurements or the grape ripening processes, but also all the way to wine composition and wine style. The innovative monitoring tools are included in here as well, because all of these measurements that we are doing, the plant water status and all these others, they form reference data to test a lot of different sensors, different methodologies, to not have to do this kind of work because it's not practical for farmers to do such a study. But if we can find the right tools and sensors and have them tested, that could be deployed on a more practical level. I think what is very important for us is I indicate phases here in this project. It's very important to validate that our experimental design is working, and I will show a little bit of results from that. And then we have a number of seasons planned in the first phase of the project to now generate the data. From this season onwards, it's all about the comparative analysis that we do. Very important for us is that we include the training of students, the showcasing of results to producers, to technical people in industry as part of our project on an annual basis. And also a very important aspect, there is a financial analysis linked to this project as it unfolds, to see what the impact is of the different scenarios that we're generating. So just to come back to the important steps to generate a model vineyard, like we said yesterday when Tara presented also, it's very important to profile and characterize a vineyard in terms of, for example, the temperature profiles, the slopes. All of these things provide layers of information And that can go into predicting a suitable experimental layout. And then we need to verify it. We need to optimize it. And maybe there are some steps that we have to go back to get to that stage. And in this vineyard, the topography of the vineyard, this is a topography chart to show, and these points here are all the measuring points. And I think this is an important point. We don't have a vineyard and we have 1 or 2 measuring points. We cover it with a grid of measuring points, and that gives us the capacity to really look at the variability and the detail within this vineyard. The topography shows us that in terms of altitude, there's a distance of a difference of around about 6 meters. This is the highest point in the vineyard. That's the lowest point in the vineyard. And it helps us to have these visual patterns that we can link things then back to. In terms of here is you have the same chart on the topography, but in blue, green, and red, it's indicated the random design of the different irrigation regimes. Blue indicates panels of vines, remember 5 vines each, that are irrigated to the industry standard, well watered. The green ones are in between a much reduced level of irrigation. The red ones are the panels where it's dry land. I don't indicate the Chenin Blanc in here. You know that they're running in between there as the dry land and around in the well-watered conditions. Climate monitoring, you can see here from the previous season, we can accurately indicate the rain events, how much rain, and we can accurately decide see what the temperature profiles for the whole season was. The validation in this block gave us a lot of hope that our system is working, because on this graph we're looking at the total available water in the block. This is months in the season. This is November, December, January, February, March. And remember, the blue is well watered, green is reduced irrigation, and then red is the dry land. And starting off in November last year, when we measured the available soil water over the profile there, we saw that those panels, because of the good rains, they had the same amount of water, all of the panels that we have there. But as the season progressed, we saw that the irrigation regimes led to the predictable pattern that we were looking for. Higher levels of water available to the well-watered, lowest levels in the dry land, and with the green one in between. So this is part of the validation of the experiment. The benefit of having this kind of approach with a lot of data points is we can study the geospatial effects. You would miss the details of this vineyard, and your data becomes less accurate if you only have a few points here. It's very clear from these maps. This is again the available soil water over months. Now looking at the geospatial effects, all those points in the vineyard, this is November, there are certain parts in this vineyard which is just more wet than others, which is not linked to the irrigation alone. It is also linked to the geospatial effects, because the blue background here gives us an indication of how much water is there. And what is also important for us is that we get confidence that the irrigation regimes are separating the dry land panels all along in the season from the well-watered, which is, of course, an important aspect. Now, in the Chenin Blanc experiment, in the past season, and I'm just going to show a few pieces of information here because I'm going to run out of time, it's very clear. Oops, I went too fast. It's very clear that the dry land condition reduced the biomass. This is now winter biomass. And when in the winter period, when we looked at the number of shoots and compared the well-watered to the dry land combinations, the different rootstocks here, Chenin Blanc on the different rootstocks, we saw that in most cases, the well-watered combinations had much higher number of shoots than the dry land planted Chenin Blancs on the different rootstocks. Interestingly, there was one rootstock that did not, the Poulsen rootstock resulted in the same number of shoots, irrespective of the irrigation regime. There was also some this is the same. It just shows that this is now shoot weight. So looking at not only at the number of shoots that we could get from that, but also the shoot weights in the pruning period. A very clear distinction in terms of how the Chenin Blanc is responding in terms of biomass. Please don't think that those plants look bad. These ones that were in the dry land conditions, they look very good. And if you visit the vineyard, you will be, we were surprised how well they develop. And I think it attests to the plasticity, the ability of this cultivar to adapt also to the dry land conditions. So again, the spatial patterns, if we take the Chenin Blanc data now, the pruning weights and the shoot number, and put it on the maps, we get the predictable pattern, again validating our approach. The blue ones here are the well-watered, and you can see in all the instances they are separating from the middle part, which is the dry land Chenin Blancs. So, and the same. Also, when we look at the physiological response of the plants, looking in this case at the stem water potentials, the midday stem water potentials, it's very clear that the well-watered vines here on the edges had lower levels, experienced lower levels of water stress compared to the dry land plants. So I'm showing you the validation data where we said, does the vineyard work in the way that we want it to work? And yes, we are quite happy with it. And the integrated vineyard monitoring systems using innovative technologies is a crucial part of this project, where I'm not showing the data, but all of that, the context that I've given now, we can use canopy characterization tools. We have a vineyard robot that we implement in this block as well, equipped with LiDAR and several other sensors to actually map the canopy during the season. We can use thermal cameras to not only use indirect ways to look at the plant stress, but also specifically monitor the impacts of the environmental conditions on the plants. And the same with yield monitoring. There are sensors, devices that we can use for that kind of work. So this is an exciting part of the project, and I need to acknowledge Dr. Carlos Poblete, Talita, and Thomas Chalmers, students that are a student that is working on this part of the project as well. Then, as I mentioned, the stress memory part, I just want to talk a minute or so about that. I mentioned to you that we can measure all these standard methodologies, but we should acknowledge that plants also have the ability to intrinsically adapt to stressful events. And this particularly links to the fact that plants, grapevines as well, respond to and remember stresses, and they get better at dealing with stress over time. So this aspect is linked to the phenotypic plasticity, and particularly in terms of epigenetics. I'm not going to give a long lecture about epigenetics, but it basically tells us that non-lethal stress changed the structure of the DNA of the plant. It's not changing the genome, but it's changing the expression of the genome. So it means it leads to adaptability over time, which equals resilience, and it influences the functioning of its plant and its metabolites. And in this case, we have an honor student and also Dr. Philip Young working on this part, particularly to look at the stress memory. And this vineyard provides us with a very good way to see if we have a primary first exposure to stress, because we're following the vineyard from the beginning. First exposure to stress, second exposure, how does the plant respond to this, and do we actually build a stress memory? So this is a set of data where we sample when the plant doesn't have any stress, and then later again when we know it experienced some stress. And just from the preliminary analysis, we can see that there are rootstock differences. For example, this is a Shiraz combination on a specific rootstock, and it doesn't have this characteristic shift in the methylation pattern, for example, clearly showing that there's some interesting patterns here that we need to explore. So I'm not going to go into that more because that's a separate lecture. The last aspect that I want to talk about is the fact that we are also looking at the microbiomics, the microbes in the soil. So the whole concept of the extrinsic factors, we discussed it earlier today, this morning, and it comes back to the plant holobeyond concept. It basically says that the plant and its success or resilience is also dependent on all the microorganisms that it's associated with, not only in the soil, but particularly in the soil, but also, of course, on the rest of the plants. So we're incorporating this aspect into the study. So the context that we generate in the vineyard is being studied to determine the temporal spatial dynamics of the microorganisms on the root surface in the surrounding soil. We evaluate the core microorganisms involved there. There might be rootstock effects that we will be able to look at, and also hopefully we can assess and correlate also the soil conditions, the water conditions with the microorganisms presence. And Evodia Satati and Mfundo Shange is involved in this part of the work. So brings me to the end, and I spoke about the integrated vineyard monitoring systems. We spoke about available to store it and to curate it. And it's very important for us to showcase the research as we go along. As I mentioned, if you're in South Africa, in the South African industry, we will invite people to come and visit the vineyard, show the results as we go along and not at the end of the project. Yeah, and I think the data from the validation experiment proved to us that the vineyard is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's a good experimental setup, and we're looking forward to the next, particularly this season and the seasons beyond. And I would like to extend a word of welcome to people listening to this, perhaps seeing or having an idea or having a criticism. Please engage with us. If you have an idea to collaborate with us, you're also very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm going to call for Talita Venter. She's going to look at one specific block, one specific cultivar, yes, with 19 different trellising, yes, systems.
All right. Oh, perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's almost afternoon. I think I don't have a lot of data to show you today, so it's a little bit of a different approach. It's more explained to you from a lecture perspective or a also student involvement perspective, as well as research capabilities, what we've got going on Welgevallen in addition to the fit for purpose block that Melania has just, okay, all right, there we go, hope that's better. So we've got the fit for purpose research block, but we also have various other vineyards that I will be going through today, but specifically our one block, one cultivar, which I'm sure you can all guess what that cultivar is, on 19 different trellising systems. So I'm not sure, am I supposed to push something here to make... Ja? Ja. Oké. Wat se knoppie moet ek druk? Jammer. Oké, wag, hou aan. Hulle wag vir wys vir my. I'm not sure.
Slow.
Okay, all
You have
right.
to speak slowly for translating purposes.
Right, I will do that too.
And you push straight, you aim at the dice.
I'll save.
You do swirl.
100%, die gaat ons. Okay, right. Technology is never my friend, so... Okay, so firstly, Welgevallen Vineyards, that is our experimental farm at Stellenbosch University. It's near the Kutsenberg campus, and as we've mentioned, Route 5 will be taking us there. Let's just quickly see, that's the first slide. Okay, so let's get going. It's the Training and Research Vineyard Initiative that was started in 2020. So Belgevallen has always had vineyards, but they were all dry land. And in 2020, there was an initiative between the Faculty of Agri-Sciences and also our industry partner, Vinpro, who then both provided funding, but also, especially from Vinpro's side, a lot of managerial inputs and also resources, human resources, to make that happen. So they actually managed the whole planting process in collaboration with the department. So it's a long-term learning and training facility as well as a research facility, and that is the aim behind why it was done. And also to look forward into what we can actually extract the information from this wonderful resource that we now have at our fingertips, basically, or at our feet, almost. So the importance, obviously, of this is to link it to the curriculum as well, and also to open it up for research purposes. So we've got the fit-for-purpose model vineyard, which is predominantly for research, but there's also a training and learning leg to that I'll just touch on. We've got a cultivar and rootstock demonstration block, so that means that from that block. The student winemaking block is a fun one where we have identified various cultivars that would be of benefit for the students to use in their third-year winemaking practicals. So we actually produce those grapes here on site for them, and then we can take it from there. Then we've also got a pruning system block that I think has got 11 different pruning systems in it that is established on Cabernet Sauvignon, and then of course, the trellising system block, which is established on Chenin Blanc with 19 different trellis systems. So there's a various array of that. So if we're thinking about linking to the curriculum, we have various things in terms of vineyard management and also canopy management that is taught on the third-year level. So we're thinking of everything from vine development, vineyard establishment, training of a vineyard onto a specific trellis system, and then in terms of canopy management, what we also have to look at for assessing canopy quality and also the consequences of poor canopy quality, what's the result, and also the various techniques. So that's also the practical application of everything that is taught in the curriculum. So by taking this as a whole package, we can then also, obviously that's the theoretical backbone, but we also have to go look at some of the other skills that we teach our students. So that's mostly through what we call the project modules on second and third year level, where we also focus on some research skills, experimental design comes into that, also data collection. So the students do a lot of activities in these vineyards, collecting data, not only in the irrigation block, but also some of the other blocks, and then basic data analysis, statistical analysis, and also very important to teach them how to do data interpretation. I think that's quite a valid skill, critical thinking for one day when they go to the workplace as well. So we're moving away from just plain theory. There's a lot of practical application involved, learning them things from moving canopy wires to suckering, and then also, as I said, all these softer academic skills that can be really valuable later on. So that's also a way of human capacity building in terms of the research projects. And of course, with all of these vineyards that we now have at our toes, we do need to make use of those and actually extract the valuable information that we can get. So by doing that, we can use students through their learning to also then gather that information and teach them new skills. So it's much easier to actually take the students to a vineyard and get them to get a feel for it and apply what they get taught in class. As I've mentioned, we do various other developments. On the board, you can see we are doing some what we call the lateral leaf area measurements through image analysis. That's one of the fun activities that we always work in. It's something very tangible and something quite unique. And then, of course, viticulture is very complex, and I always teach the students that every action has a reaction. And I think that's very important from this perspective as well, why we've decided to establish all these vineyards on one site. Because everything you do, we'll get to that just now as well, the mesoclimate, the soil, everything's going to have an effect. So we have to actually, we're in a very good position now to have all of these vineyards on one specific site. Yeah. So benefits to research from, especially if you're now thinking about the trellising vineyard, There's enough vines in that of each trellis system to be able to do selective canopy management actions, so we can try and do various alternative methods within each trellis system to test various questions that we may have. There's the vegetative component, so that's the obvious ones that come to mind is pruning mass and shoot number and lateral leaf areas. That's quite simple things to measure and determine. Canopy quality, there we can also look at perhaps going more sensor-based route, yield parameters, yield per vine, average bunch mass, the usual parameters. And then we can also pull this through all the way to wine quality. So that is the idea eventually, is to be able to also assess the wine quality of the different trellising systems on a small scale. Also, the big benefit is the reduced variability. I think any viticultural experiment is usually not hampered, but made challenging through inherent variability, whether it be in the site or the soil. So by having all of these 19 cultivars in 19 trellis systems on one cultivar in one place is a real benefit, and I think it's very unique as well. We also, as we've mentioned, do want to do demonstration days, field producer days. We've had a big launch in 2021, I think. Yes, 2021, we did a big launch for the industry partners. So it's something that we want to showcase. It's supposed to be a demonstration block where industry partners can also come and see firsthand what the effects are. Also, we can assess the vine performance under the various trellis systems, which will also give us some indication of what could possibly work in other scenarios for various producers. And finally, I think it's supposed to be a decision-making tool. So it's supposed to, from this demo block, we're going to have a lot of questions that arise, and then hopefully through that we can make some informed decisions through critical thinking and evaluation for vineyard planning for the future, etc. So you might ask what the potential measurements are. I've gone through it quickly, but consistency is important. So the one main thing is that we're going to have to measure from the same vines every year. So the idea is to mark specific test panels within each trellis system, and then every year we can collect the data from that specific set of vines. So that will obviously give us consistency over time, because we will be comparing the same vines over time to make sure that we are looking at the same things. Right. So as I've mentioned, lateral leaf area and pruning mass is very simple to do with students, and also the yield components. And canopy quality, always fun to go running around with a septometer, red measurements. Obviously, that's just a little bit of an implication for how many of that instruments we've got available, but that's something that will be able to give us a quantification of the canopy quality within those trellis systems as well, especially on the cordon level. So why did we choose Chenin Blanc? I think mostly it has come out during this, the talk so far that Chenin Blanc is very important for the South African industry. About 20% of our total plantings is on Chenin Blanc, so it's about 10,000 hectares, yay. And it's also extremely versatile. So I think that is also within the various areas and also within various producers, there's various styles that we can actually produce, from some producers making a proudly South African MCC between Chenin Blanc and Pinotage, to quality wines, a bulk wine that can be used for distilling purposes. So really the possibilities are endless. And then obviously there's new movements towards the old vine Chenin Blanc and other quality-driven styles. So that's definitely something that's really important for our industry. So it is truly a cultivar of opportunity, I believe. And that's a bit of a more holistic approach of why we chose it, but also from a practical sense, it's a strong grower. It has upright growth habit, so makes it quite versatile for bush vine production as well as trellis production. And then also there's some potential problems in terms of sunburn, or perhaps if you've got a dead canopy for rot. But that can be translated to other cultivars that may also have the same problem. So you can see, will Chenin Blanc work on a sprawling system? So perhaps if you expose the bunches early enough to sunlight, you won't have sunburn issues. So that's something that can also be investigated. So the idea is we can see what's going to work and what's not going to work. And if something doesn't work in that trellis system, then we can also quantify why and see how that can be adapted. Because perhaps someone in the industry is already going to have a sunburn-sensitive cultivar on that system, and they could perhaps make adaptations to then get around the problems. Okay, so once again, our little floating grape bunch. So that's where our trellis system block is located on Belgevallen. And basically, the importance of a trellis system is it's a long-term decision. It's also based on, it's a lot of capital investment that goes into it. So you have to make the right decision at the start in order to be successful. You need to be able vine in the end, and also the vertical trellis system. So if you're looking at that, that's basically your hedge trellises and what we call the perilled. It's quite challenging. So we've also got double lengthened perilled, so that, or lengthened double perilled. So that's where there's split canopies. So if you're looking at what I call a high density system, so that's either in terms of narrower spacing or train track spacing, where you've got a higher density of vines per hectare, or otherwise where you've actually increasing the canopy volume for the same root volume. So we find that often a good solution in South Africa, where we tend to have happier vines with mostly very good soil quality, especially in the Stellenbosch area where we've got high potential soils and you're expecting that you're going to have a high vigor situation. So one way of getting that vine into balance is by expanding the amount of canopy that you support with a limited root volume. All right, so also just try and curb the vigor. Hello? Yeah, all right. Okay, so voice is back online. Now I quickly have to think what was coming next. All right. Yeah, I don't want to lose too much time. We're already running behind schedule, so I'm going to try and carry on without my... Oh, there we go. Everything's up. Fabulous. Great. So, okay, it's up on my side, so I can talk. Okay, so basically, like I said, we've seen a lot of good results with the lyre system, especially because of that increased canopy dent or canopy volume in relation to a reduced or beperkte, what is... That's a goeie word. Limited, thank you. Limited root volume. Okay, and now something's disappeared this way again. Okay. Okay, then we also get to some of the, fabulous. Okay, so we also have sprawling or mechanized systems. So that's the ballerina system, where some of the shoots that grow in between the foliage wires are remained upright. And whatever does not go into the foliage wires will then just sprawl outwards. And we also have the, I know it's disappeared, I'm just going to carry on. We've also got what we call the high wire systems. So that is 1 or 2 high wire system, which is adapted for mechanical pruning, and that mechanical pruning can also be done manually. I'll say, there they are. One problem with a one wire system is typically that you find that as the shoots become heavier in the developing shoots, in terms of bigger producers who actually have the machinery available and the layout that can handle that. Then we get to the various divided canopy systems. So we've spoken about horizontal divides, but also on the vertical divisions would be an interesting one is a Ruakura 2-tier. So that's the 2K2T. It's not very often used, but it's also something that's quite, I think, beneficial in terms of looking at what alternatives there are. In the South African industry, we are stuck on hedge trellises. Most of our vineyards are hedge trellises, and perhaps there's something else out there that could be more beneficial going forward as well, especially to manage our expected vigor, which sometimes is a nightmare. We've got the Smart Dyson and also the Scott Henry. So Smart Dyson having one vine that is then divided vertically with some shoots going up, some shoots going down, and then with the Scott Henry where there's actually 2 cordon levels from 2 different vines, with the top vines shoots going up and the bottom vines shoots being positioned down. All right, so that's also the options. So that was a very quick one, hopefully. And also, as I said, Route 5, tomorrow we will be going to the vineyard and be seeing specifically the two blocks that Melanie and I have spoken about today. So if there's any questions, please come on Route 5 and we can have some fun there.
Morning, we're going to call on our Australian friends. On va regarder un peu au chenin, l'approche du chenin en Australie.
The Chenin approach in Australia, et donc.
Where are they? Oh, here you are. And you've come so far that I'm not going to rush you. Okay. You do what you have to do. Et pour nos amis français, on va vous laisser le temps de déjeuner aussi.
For our French friends, you will have time for lunch.
So welcome in South Africa, and we're looking forward to what you're going to say.
Hello, everybody. My name's Garth Cliff. I come from Swan Valley in Western Australia. Thank you for having me at this conference. I'm here because I'm a Chenin lover, like many of you. And I guess we're here to share what we know and work towards creating better vines and better wines from this variety. And probably most importantly, to help spread the word of how good Chenin Blanc is. And I guess this congress or this congregation has started making me think, how do we describe ourselves in the world of wine or to other wine lovers? And we probably started as a bit of a cluster or a rabble, and we're sort of learning how to be, or we probably already are, an obstinacy or a thunder of Chenin lovers right now. And hopefully next time it'll be a party or a festival every time somebody gets out a bottle of Chenin Blanc. So today I'm telling you a story that will give you a background on the history of Chenin Blanc in Western Australia and set the foundations for the modern era of Chenin production. So this is in support of Nick's talk, which will follow and cover Western Australia's modern era of Chenin Blanc, which covers the last decade or so. And I guess I'm hoping in telling this story and tracing back the lineage and evolution of the wine industry, and Chenin in particular, it creates amazing stories about where we are today. And it's often done through anecdotal sort of word of mouth stories and incomplete evidence. And so some of the information that I am going to say today maybe helps complete some of your stories, and maybe somebody here can help me complete our Western Australian story. So. Okay, so I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we in southwest Western Australia work and play on. Noongar, whose connection to the land, waters and communities span 60,000 years. We pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to all of our First Nations people. So yeah, there's two emergent stories in Australia. The first grapevines were planted in Sydney around 1790, and like the Perth colony's initial plantings, which were a bit later in 1827, they largely died. Vines were subsequently brought into that sort of Hunter Valley area of Australia. But I guess promise was seen in this, and a guy called James Busby was commissioned by the Sydney sort of government to take cuttings from Spain through to Champagne. He's widely regarded as the father of Australian wine, and I guess it's on the back of bringing all these varieties back. The varieties were donated to Sydney Botanic Gardens, and where most of them perished once again. So fortunately, he, I guess, had a hunch that this might happen, and he planted a large amount of these in his property in the Hunter Valley. This collection is largely responsible for the development of viticulture throughout New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and then onto New Zealand as well. So many of Australia's wines, classic vines that you guys might be familiar with, may stem back to that original collection. So, and I guess he was commissioned to focus in on Spain, but then also travel because of the similarity in our climate, I guess, and then head through Rhone, Roussillon, and then to, I guess, the more traditional wine-producing areas of Bordeaux and Champagne, Burgundy and Champagne. So almost concurrently, a guy called Thomas Waters, he was tasked by the British government to find plant species that would flourish in the Western Australian colony of Perth. And this, I guess, initially was because of dying livestock, nourished livestock or livestock. In amongst what he brought over was grapevines, olives and so on. These vines were planted in 1829, and the following year he dug the cellar of Australia's second oldest winery, Olive Farm, which is in Chenin Valley. So Waters, so this is our first South African connection. Waters had spent 1823 to 1829 as a plant collector, and in this time had learnt to make wine from the Boers. There are invoice records from 1823 to 1829 while he was in South Africa, and then also from 1832 to 1848 when he was in the Perth colony working as a gardener, let's say. Early wine grapes, so there's not much clue here yet, but early wine grapes were termed Sweetwater, Muscadel and White Cluster, and a few other varieties. And based on current grapevine prevalence in Swan Valley, we've got to assume that these are varieties like Chenin Blanc, Verdelho, Semillon and Pedro Jimenez. So, the Perth colony was a long way from the other colonies of Australia, and it took until 1840 for the first land crossing of Australia, and most of that crew turned back because it was so hard. It was a long way, conditions were harsh. I guess on this, I think the road that goes across Australia, it was only paved, I think, in the 60s or bitumenised in the 60s. So if you can imagine driving 2,500, 3,000 kilometres along a dirt track to get from Perth to Adelaide. So this isolation meant that it was easier to get external supplies from Europe or South Africa than from the rest, than to trade with the rest of Australia. And Perth had a low population base. Like if we look at the population of the rest of Australia, it was larger and it grew faster. Perth started with a population of, let's say, 3,000 or 4,000, and it had only grown to around 30,000 by the 1900s. So I guess along with this, as we developed further, we had strict east to west quarantine procedures, and while no doubt keeping our vines clean, keeping our fruit clean, it also meant that we didn't really have many varieties coming across from over east, or it was difficult, and that our major import of vine material had come from South Africa, and then another source of material when we started getting post-World War immigrants. And because of this, just in general, we have unique wines in part because of our climate and soils, but also because of our source material, which is, that early source material is entirely different to the rest of Australia. So by 1832, Waters was selling wine by the gallon, And by 1843, he had an extensive vineyard of around 12,000 vines in the Middle Swan. And on top of that, supposedly the wines that he was making were described as very good by the Agricultural Society. Back then, table grapes and currants and food were a bigger industry for Swan Valley of the time. So over the next decade, a number of businesses formed that contributed to our early wine industry, and amongst them were Horton and Sandalford, which are Australia's third and fifth oldest wine businesses that still exist today. So setting the stage, Chenin Blanc was prevalent and was being made in Burgundy from a variety that was termed. And on top of this, like, because and first just draining off that free run, I think it's really interesting because that wine. So over the next decades, the Horton property grew to 100, and a second property was set up in 1967, and in the most part to supply this wine. At this stage, the wine had evolved to be 50% Chenin Blanc and had varieties like Verdelho, Muscadel and Chardonnay in lower proportions. 1968 to 1970 saw the correct ampelographic identification of Chenin, or what was known as Swan Valley Semillon. Chenin Blanc had been sent from Mildura, which is Central Australia, to Swan Valley, and this would have come from Davis University. And Doran Mann, I guess, was involved in the project to a degree. And as he saw the first leaves grow from the cuttings of Chenin Blanc, he saw that it sort of twigged, like, I recognise what this is. It's the characteristic dark green leaves, white furry undersides. We've got it all over the valley. And so that was when we realised that we had Chenin Blanc. And then that was confirmed by a French ampelographer, Dr. Max Rive, in 1970. So from here in the early 70s, we saw the first wines named Chenin Blanc, with Sandalford in 1973, and then Kosovich by 1975, and Mundar Brook by the 70s, late 70s. Kosovich has continuously produced Chenin since his stay, and he remains the style benchmark of Chenin for Australia. And Kosovich releases this wine after 5 years of bottle aging. So a fondness for fortified wines, establishment of cool climate viticulture, and a preoccupation with the traditional noble French varieties ensured Chenin did not gain a large following. Chenin across most regions in Australia, as was the case in much of the world, it was seen as a variety that yielded well and retained good acidity and made it a good wine for commercial production. So enter Amberley Wines of Margaret River. In 1986, a dentist and an accountant and a vineyard consultant who was named Albert Hark. And here is where South Africa's influence enters Western Australia's Chenin story again. Albert grew up in South Africa and worked through the 70s at the Enological and Viticultural Research Institute in Stellenbosch as an engineer. In the early 80s, he made plans to emigrate with his family to Western Australia, and he was astonished to discover that there was no equivalent of the off-dry steins that were popular in South Africa. There was a niche in the market for them to strive to. And after 3 months of travelling, digging holes, and surveying the Margaret River area, he found a site that was to plant, have a multi-tiered brand with an entry-level Chenin at $12 and a Merlot, a $15 to $16 SSB, and a top-of-the-range Chardonnay and Bordeaux blend. But who could predict how successful the Chenin would be? They priced it so that the bottle shops would get behind it. They were minimally pruning, irrigating and yielding around 25 tonnes to the hectare, and they couldn't make enough. And that was the start of the Chenin revolution. Running out of stock, grapes, and abandoning estate principles, they were blending in 15% Sauvignon Blanc, buying Chenin from Swan Valley if they could, but importantly, they started a program of signing up contract growers with 7-year contracts to plant Chenin Blanc pretty much wherever they could, at whatever yield they could manage, and get $1,500 to $2,000 per tonne. So Horton White Burgundy and Amberley Chenin Blanc are tremendously important to where Chenin is today, in that they are the wines that inspired the large plantings of Chenin Blanc throughout Western Australia in the early mid-20th century and then again through the 1990s. And it is for this reason that current generations of winemakers have access to sizable plantings of 30-plus-year-old Chenin Blanc vines. So a few facts. WA produces around half of Australia's Chenin Blanc with 1,600 tonnes from the Swan District, which is the larger area that also contains Swan Valley. Margaret River has around 900 tonnes of production, and these two together total about 50% of Australia's production. There are premium Chenin Blanc vineyards scattered throughout many of Australia's wine regions. But the other majority of the grapes comes from the sort of central riverland regions, the irrigated regions, where it's still used as a padding out sort of wine in white blends. So that brings me almost to the end, but I've got a few photos. So here we've got a vine in the Swan Valley. It's on a alluvial soil. That would be planted, my guess is in around about 1915. It was planted definitely before 1930, and this is a current photo, so that's how big it is. Yeah. And I guess it's a disappointing story in some ways, because you can see with these aerial photos that this is Swanville in 1965. In 2010, it was probably in not as good nick, the vineyard, but it was still there. And then in 2012, almost all of the vineyard was gone. So if the revolution had happened a little earlier, then maybe we would have this vineyard or a large amount of this vineyard. So that pretty much concludes my bit, and I'll pass on to Nick.
Thank you, Garth, for the history of Chenin Blanc in Australia. I'll be sort of continuing with a sort of more personal story about what's happened in the last 10 years in Australia regarding Chenin Blanc. So in 2011, I was studying a Masters of Wine at Adelaide University, and a South African winemaker actually visited the class, and he brought over a representation of the best of South Africa. Until that point in my life, I'd actually never tried a South African wine, to be honest. And I sat there, and this winemaker named Bertus Guri brought out these three Chenin Blancs. And it was a day that changed the trajectory of my life. Up until that point, my family had always grown Chenin Blanc. We planted Chenin in the 1980s. And made a style similar to what Garth was talking about with the Amberley Chenin Blanc. My experience with the variety mimicked a lot of those in Australia at the time. It was a grape associated with sweet or semi-sweet wine, and my friends often talked about it being a gateway drug for young teenagers to get into wine. It was cheap, sweet and easy. Although having a rich history in our country, besides a few notable examples, such as Kosovic, who you can try out there today, it was a variety that producers didn't touch, and this was from about 2000-ish onwards. Producers didn't touch, and drinkers didn't understand or know. back at this university tasting, I sipped on a Chenin Blanc that absolutely blew my mind. As Bertus talked about old vines, treating the grape with care, and the methods of production, a notable terroir in South Africa, a light bulb turned on in my head. If Chenin Blanc can taste this good, why aren't more Australians producing it? We have the history, as Garth sort of mentioned. We have a relatively large amount planted with mature, low-yielding vines. And we have the winemaking skill and technology. And a little bit of me was thinking, the South Africans can do it, surely we can as well. So, why wasn't there more people making it? When I asked winemakers in Australia about Chenin, they said they loved making it, but no one would buy the variety in Australia. It was too hard to sell. When I asked sommeliers, they said they loved the variety, particularly French Chenin Blanc, but there was no one in Australia that was really producing it, and it was always a hand sell. So it seems very difficult to comprehend here at an international Chenin Congress, but at the time in Australia, Chenin Blanc was a nothing variety that nobody wanted to drink. And given that context, we decided to make a Chenin Blanc. The thought was, you know, as sort of what Bertus sort of said to the group about South African wines, if we sourced fruit from incredible existing sites of low-yielding mature vines and treated the grape with care in the winery, in the vineyard, not making, you know, bulk machine-harvested styles, but hand-picking it, whole bunch pressing it, barrel fermenting it, and making a style that people actually wanted to drink, as opposed to the norms at the time of that semi-sweet style, and packaged the wine well and sold the story of Chenin Blanc, we could make it work, or possibly we could make it work. But it was a really bad time in Australia to be making wine. It was, 2010, it was the global financial crisis. There wasn't much money around. The Australian dollar was actually on parity with the US, so exports were dead. And there was an incredible grape glut in Australia, a huge amount of grapes for the actual supply that we were selling. But every cloud has a silver lining. Because of this, historic fruit contracts had been broken. Fruit was cheap, so cheap that the first year that I made a Chenin Blanc, a grower told me that if I paid for the picking, he would give me the fruit for free. In the first few years in Australia, we made this wine, and still to this day, I think that this wine was one of the best that I've made, but distributors told us to stop making it. Stock built up so much so that we didn't make it in the following year. It was too much of a risk. Notable Australian somms told me that I should give up. Nobody is going to buy your Chenin. We would just buy French. Drinkers in Australia kept asking why it wasn't sweet. And bottle shops didn't want to take a wine that people didn't understand or buy. And then that's where we thought about giving up. Then an order came in from England. The UK market was much easier. The South Africans and the French had already done the groundwork. Drinkers understood the variety, its versatility, and its flavour. We sold the majority of our first production to the United Kingdom in the first sort of year and came back to Australia with a newfound confidence. In Australia at that time, the natural wine movement or new wave producers, they were sort of just gaining momentum. And there were a lot of younger, new producers and new drinkers that were interested and wanted to work with Chenin. There was the fruit available, and the fruit was often a third of the price of Chardonnay. So it made wines of equal quality, so it was sort of a no-brainer. The market just needed to understand the variety. In early 2019, an explosion of Chenin Blanc, Australian Chenin Blanc, entered the market with a groundswell of young, enthusiastic producers sort of screaming to whoever would listen how good this variety is and why we should all drink more of it. I think I have some slides. Hopefully this works. Nope. Oh, that way? It doesn't matter too much. They're just photos of me. So, at At the same time, we decided to host the world's first, as we sort of put it out to the media, International Chenin Blanc Symposium and Sausage Sizzle, with modest aspirations and the aim of benchmarking Australian Chenin Blanc to the best in the world and create a broader awareness in Australia about Chenin Blanc. And that's when Ina got in touch. She kindly sort of mentioned to me, because I put out the press release without even researching whether I was the first or not to create an International Chenin Blanc Symposium, and she kindly corrected me and told me about this incredible event. And since then, a friendship has blossomed, and Ina has since sent South African wines to our humble little event in Australia. The first year that we did this event, it was difficult to find Australian representation. Now there are so many local producers that we have to be quite selective on the quality that sort of comes in. And in regards to viticulture during this event, what we've sort of found is it mirrors this event. Old vines matter. Younger vines produce in Australia quite watery Chenin Blanc, but fortunately most of the plantings in Australia are 30 years plus. It has an amazing ability to express terroir, and we have one producer which you can taste out there, Remy, who makes 3 different Chenins from vines that are only 20 kilometres apart with the same method, and they're completely different wines. Dry grown, in my personal opinion, dry grown and organic seem to have more concentration of flavour and obviously its ability to hold acid. In regards to winemaking, my auntie actually holds a international Chardonnay tasting, and at this Chardonnay tasting, all of the Chardonnays are incredible, but they're all sort of the same. They're all made in pretty much a similar method, and you're going there looking for these subtle differences. With Chenin, there's this vast complexity and diversity in both the styles that are made and how the wine is made, which is quite exciting. And it's exciting to the punters that come along to the event, because you just can't pigeonhole Chenin Blanc. Treating the grape with care and attention that it deserves really matters. And obviously what we found, a focus on quality over volume is essential for this to work. I mean, volume can be the result in marketing of quality, but not the other way around. And we wouldn't have got the press in Australia if we were just producing bulk Chenin Blanc, but making very good stuff, people sort of started to make notice. We've seen this growth in popularity in Chenin Blanc in the last 10 years, being a win at nearly every level. Where before growers were giving away the fruit, now they're getting higher and higher prices. New regions in Australia are actually planting the variety because it's economical and environmentally very viable. You know, it holds its acid, so a lot of Australia is quite warm, and they're looking for a variety that's not Chardonnay that they can still charge a premium price for. And there aren't actually that many white varieties that can kind of get to that same level that Chenin Blanc can. Drinkers are enjoying it because they're getting incredible value and quality. And on the marketing side, we found that actually having more producers involved, in Australia at least, meant that it didn't mean less pie for each of us. It actually meant that more people contributed to this pie, and it led to more domestic sales of Chenin Blanc and more people searching for international expressions of this incredible variety. So 12 years ago, tasting a South African Chenin Blanc, and I listened to a story from that South African about what's made it so special, and it changed the trajectory of my life. Here we are, 2 out of 200 guests, speaking at an international Chenin Congress, and I hope together that as a group we can learn from this and collectively learn from the event and produce more incredible in Chenin Blanc. And I hope that there's probably a student maybe in the room that will go out this afternoon and taste one of our Chenins, and it will change the trajectory of their life like it did mine. Being here confirms just sort of one thing, that individually our voice is just a whisper, but collectively we can shout. One producer in one country doesn't sell Chenin Blanc. Together we can conquer the world. So thank you very much. We managed to get 6 of our wines out here, and Garth and I sort of selected them. There's my wine, Garth's wine, one of the John Kosovich wines, which is sort of the oldest style in Western Australia. Oh, it isn't? Sorry about that, Kosovich isn't there. Yeah. So half of the wines are from Margaret River and half of the wines are from the Swan Valley. Yeah, so... And where can they taste them? Yeah. Oh, that way. Like, when you get to the first door, there's another door. So keep going. Yeah. Thank you.
You are a little bit fired. Okay, so that was the one message. The second message, please don't forget that our cause of the Congress is Pebbles Project. And we haven't had a lot of time to speak about that. You will see when you come into the entrance, there is a display, but Pebbles Project invests in the children and the families of the wine industry. But not only just like by little snippets, we take the life of the child and actually follow the child and accompany him throughout the process. So please, there's a raffle. You can buy a ticket. All proceeds will go in support to the Pebbles Project. And I think tonight, if I'm not mistaken, there will be a draw and we will announce the winner at the gala evening. And you can go home all the way back to Australia or to France with a wonderful piece of art that was done by Sumi, one of the wonderful artists in South Africa that also works very closely with the Pebbles Project. So that's the one thing. And the last thing tonight is the gala event. I hope that you've bought tickets because it's not all inclusive. If you would like to go, and it's a sit-down dinner and it's being held at Longreach, wonderful. If you would still like to go, please speak to Ina or any of the organizers of the Chenin Congress. Yes, again, I'm not sure if there's still availability, but Ina will know. Okay, so all questions to Ina. Have a wonderful lunch and then have a wonderful afternoon, whether you go on the route or stay and taste the wines. Thank you.